Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I'm really excited about this episode. We're going to have, it's not as much of an interview as a conversation with an old friend of mine who is also a musician, as you can tell if you're watching the YouTube version, and an author and somebody who I've always looked up to and respected as a creative artist for many, many, many years. Duncan Barlow is my guest. Welcome to the podcast, Duncan.
Thanks for having me. And it's always great. Like, our conversations are always great. So
yeah, I'm really, we've known each other, off and on for a very, very long time since we were young punk rockers. And I know you mostly as a musician. In the early days, you were in one of the most popular bands of the Midwestern hardcore movement. At the time, when I was growing up, one of the biggest bands was Endpoint. You were the guitar player of Endpoint. You're also known as the guitar player for Guilt, a bunch of other projects. But one of the things that, at the time, we talked about, we wanted to be writers back then. and we're able to make our dreams come true. But we both had struggles with that. And we're going to get to that in a little bit, but just for a little bit of an introduction, you are the author of a couple novels, A Dog Between, The City Awake, SuperCell Anemia, which are all fantastic. The City Awake being the one that really touched me, that just really hit my weird noir bone. And, is one that I really loved. But can you just tell the folks about, some of your artistic output? Because you've got also a new record out. So tell folks what they can find out there.
Some would argue too much, but I think, well, thank you. I think, so I've got some musical projects out there from the past, and the more recent record, I put it in quotes because it had a bit of a journey that took maybe 5 to 6 years to finally get it onto vinyl and release it. But it was, it was a lot of fun to do. And it's the first thing I ever released just under my name.
Right.
Before, my sort of solo-y stuff was called D Biddle. And this one I felt like, well, it's like 95% me, so I should probably just give it my name.
And it has a fantastic video that people can see with this really beautiful animation. What's the story on that?
Anna Fitzsimons, a dear old friend of mine, who I met on the Guilt Bardstown Ugly Box tour, did this animation for it. And it is really beautiful. It's when I saw it, I teared up a little bit because I was like, wow, this is so much better than the music. But she's worked on a lot of things that people may have heard of in one way or another. Like, I think Tom and His Friends is one of them. It's like The Talking Cat, and Wolf Walkers, which was on Apple. And got some animated. It was nominated for an Oscar, and so she's really, really quite talented and a brilliant human. And was once a pro skateboarder or a snowboarder, and just a really cool history.
Yeah, and the album has it's a really interesting vibe throughout the whole thing because it has a little bit of a storytelling thing going on where it seems like, to me at least, a lot of the theme is that you're kind of processing a breakup or something on the record. And so it has a real transitional quality and It's funny because it's not the type of music I generally put on for a spin most of the time, but because it's a friend who wrote it, I put it on, and I was so impressed. It's a great record. It's you can tell that you spent a lot of time on this record, so it's really cool. So how can people find that record? Because then we'll get into the other stuff. Oh, you're muted, Duncan.
Did that to get away the mouth noise. And yeah, so they can get it at Mind Over Matter Records. There's a few of the color variants available. You can listen to it streaming on any of the services. Yeah, and you can find out more about it if you want at my website, which is just duncanbbarlow.com.
Which and when we get later in this discussion, we'll talk more about your books and your creative writing. But the thing that I wanted to bring you on to talk about is something that's like super personal to both of us, and an issue that was a big thing that we've always talked about over the years, which is the fact that we both have learning disabilities, and specifically we're both dyslexic and like had major struggles with this growing up. And the fact that we both have a couple books on at least my shelves back here was something that we talked about wanting to do as young people. But I know for me, I struggled for a long time feeling confident enough to try to write almost entirely because of my learning disabilities, feeling that I would never be able to write a clean enough draft or whatever. But so what we want to do today is talk about what it is to have a learning disability as a writer, as an artist, and how we can creatively overcome those things. And because I think both of us kind of, at least I know for me, I came up with skills and strategies to do that. So let's start with how did you learn that you had a learning disability, and at what age did that happen for you?
I guess it should have been obvious to people. But the thing was, in the 70s, dyslexia was not talked about in the way it might be today, especially while we're talking about neurodiversity in classrooms and such. But I was at about 6th grade is when it seemed pretty obvious that some kind of intervention needed to happen. I couldn't read very well, almost at all. I could barely spell or write. It was, I think that's where you become a lot more conscious of grades. And it was the first time that it looked like I was going to fail. And I was getting these welts, these giant hives that sort of, we couldn't explain. They were hot and itchy. And one time it happened to my lip, and we had to go like ice it, and we were scared it was going to rip open because it was just hanging. And the short end of the story is that I was tested. They took me to a child psychologist, and he ended up testing me, and they found that I had dyslexia. And so similarly to you, I was very fortunate that at the time my parents could afford to send me to this experimental school for dyslexia called DePaul, where I was given the proper intervention education to deal with it.
Now, you grew up in Louisville. Was this school in Louisville? Did you have to? Yeah, and so was it a smaller school or in population? Because go ahead. Sorry.
No. Yeah, I mean, in comparison to what most people go to, especially, I mean, public high school or grade schools are probably 25, 30 students in a class. Mine was 15 to or less.
Yeah, I had a graduating class of 6 at my high school, and but so my story with that was that I was always a good reader. So it was interesting because reading was never an issue for me, and I grew up in a reading family. My father is an academic; he's a professor of political science, and when we were kids, our family would read together as a family. My mom read to me a lot when I was very young, and I developed. I mean, by that time, by 6th grade, I was already an Isaac Asimov fan, which tells you that I took reading seriously and I liked it. But the problem is that when I got to school and it wasn't something I wasn't interested in, it just I couldn't see certain words disappeared. Just I lost all interest, and so what cued my family into things was that it was the fact that even though I was a good reader, even though I was failing miserably at school, and they couldn't understand why that was happening. So yeah, and I got tested. But the thing was, growing up in Bloomington, which is a college town, we didn't have a specific school. We had resource classes. But my sister, who was not even learning disabled, when she was in high school, she had a real rough time getting lost in the thousands and thousands of people. And before my mom passed away, she had told my father that she didn't care if she had to drive me an hour every day to Indianapolis. She was going to find me a school that was better. And my situation was that after my mom passed, my dad was kind of lost. He was struggling with things. And I ended up going to South for 1 year of high school. And it was a disaster. And then he felt totally awful because he said, hey, your mom said, you're not going to this school. So that's when they told me, like, what do you think of a boarding school where you can, and I jumped on it just because I thought it was a different experience going somewhere else. But we'll come back to my story on that. But for you, in Louisville, in your situation, so going to a different school, did you have to travel outside of your neighborhood to do this? And how did that affect your social life? Because, like, for a kid, that can be a big thing, going to a different school, right?
Yeah. It was interesting because, first of all, I grew up being made fun of for being stupid, right? Like,
right. Me too.
Even my closest friends that I had in the neighborhood were just like, Barlow, you're all personality. And, I think my parents to some degree had just said, I guess the kid is dim, they were very surprised when they saw my intelligent, the IQ test at the child psychologist's office. And when I went to the school, it was weird leaving all the people I knew, but I found that the students were very sweet and kind. And I think many of them had struggled the way I struggled. And so I remember Ryan Doyle sat down with me, and he was a different kind of guy altogether. He played guitar. He was really into the Beatles, and, just a really good guy. And we became like best friends. At the time, his father was president of KFC. His father started Qdoba, or like was involved in buying that or whatever. And so we would go to his house, and it was this beautiful big old house on property. And
were you already into punk rock at this point, or like just
yes.
starting? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had discovered that through a local music channel that the only thing they could play at the time, because nobody really had videos, was like weird new wave and punk bands, or proto new wave or whatever. So I grew up like on the Clash, the first Adam and the Ants record.
Now, some people might think that it's not important that punk is there, but I would argue that one of the reasons that gave us confidence to move forward like we did is that punk rock taught us that it's okay to be weird and it's okay to be different. And it was because when you're growing up getting picked on for being stupid your whole life, and you feel like you have a lot of self-hatred for yourself because you feel like those things are true and people are trying to make you feel those things, when punk rock comes along and makes you feel like, hey, no, I'm okay. I don't give a shit what those jocks think because I've got punk rock, right?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think the difference between it was when I think when I first heard My War that by Black Flag, that that was the moment, like I liked punk, but that was the moment, that first scream that I said, I just remember the moment. I was like, this is going to be my life. And that the moment that happened, I had 10 times more confidence in the world in this weird way. I like shaved half my head. I went to school. I didn't care what anybody thought,
Right. Yeah. No, for me, it was Nazi punks fuck off.
Okay.
It was Dead Kennedys. It was hearing, it was the whole record that California Uber Alice was a political song that I understood because my dad taught me politics, and that they were smart and political and they were funny. So I just, it changed my worldview for that too. So, but you were going to this different school, you met different people, but, so that probably made a huge difference in how you were able to approach school just and learning in general, right?
Well, at my school for dyslexia, it caused more problems than helped. Because it was a traditional school and it was very regimented, and there were a litany of rules, and I started pushing against them, and they did not like that. So I spent a lot of time in the office, and
I will say I did too.
And I remember one student, Mrs. Head, pulled me aside and she's like, I have seen your test results from the standardized test. Your intelligence is terrifying, and you choose to spend it like this. And I was like, terrifying? That's an interesting word. But I think
she was right. Look at what all you've accomplished, right?
I know. Look at all the bad I've accomplished. But it did, though. Like, I don't know, because my trajectory was sort of like the early 80s. I was really into the punk that I could get, and a lot of like Devo and B-52s and things like that. And then once I found a record store that actually had punk and hardcore, then I started buying more. And then I met like Mike Bacalhau at a record store from, he would later go on to King Horse. But he kind of took me under his wing in my 8th grade year. And then I'm just rolling around with college dudes that are just like looking out for me, teaching me how to be, an independent person. And I had more confidence than probably I should have, but it was nice moving from where I felt like a, weird mutant in a Catholic school to, I
ended up playing guitar in a band that was insanely popular in your hometown, and, a lot of times I heard you recently do another interview where you were talking about how, and it was strange to me because, some of the other records are getting repressed and reprinted, but Endpoint is not. And one of the things that you said in there was, well, we were a live band, right? And people don't like really understand the experience. And I was trying to explain to a young hardcore kid a couple of years ago, like why endpoint was so important in the Midwest. And I basically said at one point, well, you just kind of had to be there. You kind of had to see the experience. And I mentioned that because that's a long way from the kid who, you know, was struggling in school, and that kind of level of confidence comes with, in part, being able to figure out how to learn. And a lot of that, I think, is the confidence of, you know, of having success and doing those things and being like, you know, being comfortable in your own shoes, right? Which is something that I know, because I know you, that we both struggled with even as we're having success, is being comfortable in our own shoes, right? So
yeah, and it's odd because I was telling someone recently, I felt more confident and secure about things maybe my sophomore year than sometimes I do now as an adult. But I think that's more about, I think that is more about that I'm more cognizant of, I'm more sort of metacognitively aware of what I do, whereas then you're just like a little shark kind of moving through trying to survive, right?
Right. Well, so a little bit, I do want to talk a little bit about my journey on things, because, and I'll tell you a really funny story about my original high school, Bloomington High School South. The one that my mother had told my father, like, he's not going there, I don't care what it takes. And I ended up going there for my freshman year of high school. And one of the things that's kind of important about my high school situation is that in middle school, I was in sixth grade when they diagnosed me, right? And I had to go, the test I took, I had to go to Chicago. It was very strange. And so it was a very weird experience for me, because, like, I'm going and I'm getting all these weird tests just about my brain and what's happening. And it was at a weird apartment that we're overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago. And so I had these like really weird memories of, like, you know, we drove 5 hours, and then now you got to take all these tests, cognitive tests. It was just bizarre as a sixth grade kid.
Yeah.
And then through seventh and eighth grade, I had a great resource teacher in my middle school who really encouraged me. And those were huge periods of growth for me. That's when I started reading Stephen King and Clive Barker, and like saying, like, hey, this is what I want to do during those 2 years. It's also the time that I discovered punk rock, right? Between eighth grade and my freshman year of high school is when I discovered punk rock, went to my first shows, all that. I ended up going to this high school. And it's funny because I went back there and worked there as an adult, in working with people with disability in 1999. Like, that's way ahead of the story, but it's important because my resource teacher my freshman year of high school was super lazy, and she didn't want to do anything for me. And her name, I'll call her out for specific, well, I'm not going to call her out. Her name was Jan something. So Jan was, when I went back and worked there as an adult, was my boss. She had become the head of special education at that high school. And when I was going to school there was the first time I attempted to write a novel. Now, I'm sure it was absolute garbage, and it had like psychics and serial killers, and but, you know, I tried, right? You know, I was giving my shot at it. And my father would watch me sit at the table and I had notebooks where I was handwriting it. And he knew that I had like 7 or 8 notebooks that were filled with this novel in progress. And I had drawn a little logo for myself, for my name and all that stuff. And I was like, you know, pretty serious about it. At the time, my father was buying me books like The Stand and It, and I was reading all of them. I was reading them cover to cover, and he knew this. And he went into an IEP meeting when all my grades started coming back as like I was failing everything. Like I was just, you know, but he was sitting there watching me write this novel. So he went in And this woman, Jan, at this IEP meeting said, David has no drive. He should start thinking about vocational because he has zero drive. And my father blew a gasket. And he said, I'm sitting here watching him fill notebooks with this horror novel. And it's funny, when he told the story, he said, it may stink, but he's writing it. And he's trying. He's giving it his all, and he has drive. And so he came back from that meeting, and I was at home. I think I was watching Star Trek or something, probably. And he just came up to me and he said, what do you think about boarding school? And at the time, I was already thinking in my mind I was a little more independent than I was because I was in punk rock and all that. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, let's do it. I want to go live somewhere else. Right? And the school that I ended up at was Bremen Preparatory School, which is a school for kids with learning disabilities, which I'll talk about more later, in Carbondale, Illinois. But when I went back to work at Southern as an adult, and Jan was the head of special education, she went on and told everyone how she had great memories of me as a student. And how, and when I told my father that, he blew a gasket again. And he said, well, I'll send her a bill for your boarding school. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And then, but it was funny because I had to kind of face this woman who had totally given up on me, talking to me like, oh, I loved having you as a student. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Right, lady. But for me, that was a lot because at that point, my freshman year of high school, I was still failing. So I know you'd kind of started at DePaul like a little bit earlier. And I ended up having to do basically all my 4 years of high school and the last 3 to catch up to graduate on time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know if my friends in the hardcore scene like kind of understood like why I wasn't in Bloomington all the time. That I was going to this boarding school because I will admit at the time, like I would just tell people I was going to boarding school. I don't know if I ever admitted to too many people like, yeah, it's because I couldn't, because there was a part of me that thought like I couldn't learn at my regular high school and I felt a little like dumb about it, like it made me feel. Now that being said, we had a pretty good sense of humor about it at the school, and the school was fucking awesome, and it was really cool to me. And I was trying not to swear in this podcast because I was gonna send it to my school. But it was awesome. It was a great experience, and we'll talk more about that. But I want to talk about your experience too, as far as high school, because you were writing music. You were prolific about writing music. But when did you start like taking reading and writing seriously? Was it when you were in school still, or was that later? Because I know we talked about it back in those days, a little bit at least. Sorry, that's a lot.
No. So, like you, I got to a public high school, a very large one. I tried to go to. But the school, my undergrad, my dyslexia school had sort of, because of my rebelling, they had kind of suggested maybe he emotionally needs to stay another year. Like it's not his grades. And my parents were like, well, you can't hold him back because you don't think he's emotionally ready to leave. And I remember they were like, well, if you send him to this Catholic high school, we'll sign off on it. And my parents said, well, what do you think about that? And I said, absolutely not. And I was like, yeah, I would always just say, I'll run away. That was always my thing. I'll run away. And so I wanted to go to Brown School, which is kind of notable because, like Brian and Britt from Slint went there. The guys from Crane went there. It was a cool sort of arty public high school downtown Louisville. And that principal met with my father and said, we're not prepared to handle a dyslexic, which was like, made me really kind of instantly disliked that school. So I went to Atherton, which was like the punk school, that was like where the hoi polloi punks went. And they started me out in what it was literally called the LD section, which I was not. I was more advanced than that,
Mm-hmm.
but it took them months to get me out of the classes and try to mainstream me. And those classes I'd already fallen so far behind in, so I was doomed. And so I was already, my first few years in high school were low performing. By my senior year, I was making straight A's. I had figured out, because for me, it wasn't necessarily reading and writing that was my issue, but it was learning systems, right? So if you drop me in a system,
yes, absolutely.
If I'm not, at first I'll kind of sink and then slowly catch up, right? Like get it. I finally get it, because I need to know it inside and out. And so my junior year is when I really started trying to write that was not like, all I cared about was music at the time, right? Like that's all I cared about. And I think punk rock has that effect because it's its own culture, and you get into it and you get obsessed with it, and you start collecting things like stories from people. You know everything. You get every magazine because there wasn't any internet. You traded tapes on through Maximum Rock and Roll. It was a whole thing. And by junior year, I remember I read some Stephen King and liked it, but some of the bigger books I didn't really feel a lot of love for, because every time I had that childhood anxiety of give me a big book. To this day, you put a big book in front of me, I'm like, I know I can read it, but I'm like, oh no. And a friend, this metal dude, who's since passed, gave me a copy of Books of Blood in class because I'd asked him what he was reading, and I couldn't put it down. And I would read through classes, and I think that the teachers were just happy I was
reading,
right?
I had exactly the same experience.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It's like in high school, I don't think I ever brought a book home, right? Like I just didn't do it, and until my senior year, and then, but like I was reading, and then I told my dad about the book, and we didn't have much money, but he was like, "Well, Jesus, let's go to the bookstore." And so I got every book that Clive Barker had published up to that point and just blew through them. And then I was like, I'm going to write a story. And, my first story I tried to write was so bad, David. It was...
I have that one too.
Yeah, it was essentially like if you took the Cenobites and put them in Dante's Inferno, but done very badly. And, there was like a racer skin was one of the guys. A racer skin. And really bad. But
my first one was about a fraternity, like where like they all had to protect the severed head of the guy who got his head chopped off in their, trying to prove, I forget the term. He was trying to prove himself to the frat, and they cut his head off, and then they all had to keep his head so nobody would find out. That was my first attempt at a horror story, which it's not that bad.
No, more clever, far more clever than mine. I was not one at the time for subtlety, but I started writing poetry because I had sort of been introduced to some poetry at that point. Then I fancied myself a bit of a poet and studied that for a while. It wasn't until I started an MFA in poetry that I realized I am not a poet.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say I have one that's equally dumb too, because I also have one from seventh grade called Night in the Life of a Common Werewolf, and I still actually have that one. I found it, and it is hilariously bad. I like. I actually think there should be an anthology of published authors' first horrible attempts at stories, because I would read the hell out of that.
Mhm.
Um, but
But I mean that goes and shows because you were already reading, and you were like yours was what, sixth grade, seventh grade,
seventh grade was the Common Werewolf, and the frat one was eighth grade. Those were my
right?
first two attempts. Yeah.
I was a junior in high school at this point, right? Like, I mean, there's really like I embarrassingly say there is no excuse for, but I think that
Yeah,
the
but
only
on
thing
the
is
same note, well, you were making good music with good bands. I was making terrible attempts at bands that never got anywhere. So you succeeded on the music. So, um,
I definitely can make a few chords go a long way.
do you
But
think that learning
yeah,
guitar helped you learning to play guitar? Because I know you're self-taught. Like I know you don't read music or anything like that. So do you think that learning guitar helped you learn systems for learning? Because
you know, I maybe there's something there about that kind of order that there is to music at times. But for me, if there's any corollary that I can pull or between music and writing is that for me, both of them are so much about sound.
mm,
And um, so when I'm editing and when I'm editing other people's work, or uh, I sound out everything and try to find what the balance is, um, and how I can contribute to that to make it sort of have a music.
right. Yeah. No,
But
no. It's an important phase in the writing process is when you read it out loud to yourself. A lot of times. I
but
got
as
a.
I
I
got
got.
older, I started reading more, and I was able to. Uh, as you read more, of course, you start observing more and become a better writer. And I realized, that I think sometimes I was busy rushing things and trying to fit things, really big things, into small spaces. And I was able to learn to let moments breathe and
Mhm.
kind of get to the humanistic tradition of examining the human. But go ahead, sorry.
Right. Well, no, I got a really good piece of writing advice from William Nolan, who wrote Logan's Run. He had said to me one time that when you read out loud, make sure you don't get dramatic about it because you can trick yourself into thinking that it's a little bit more exciting than it is because you're adding your acting ability to it. And he was saying that he always reads in kind of a monotone thing because like he's always afraid that he's going to make it sound better than it actually is. And I always thought that was a great piece of advice because a lot of times I would Harlan Ellison it when I was reading like to myself. I'd get really verbose about it, and he was right. I was sometimes fooling myself on things, but I thought that was a good piece of advice, anyways. But
That's interesting. I mean, I think it can be. I think it could also be a problem though, because if you're not observing the sort of different cadence and the different volume and speed of
that's
the
true.
line, you might you might miss something. I don't know. I think
Oh yeah,
I
there's a
know.
balance for that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I know when I do a reading, I try to give a performance to a certain degree, not so much that I'm talking in a
Absolutely.
lot of funny voices, but like there's nothing harder to me than sitting through a reading of somebody who it seems like they just hate their own work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing worse than a humorless reading too, because like if it's really dour, really like it's just like ugh, it's very hard to get through. I always tell people read the funny stuff because once you get your audience laughing, they're more engaged. And yeah, I'll throw that little piece of advice out there for people doing readings. But yeah, so one thing that happened with me too in the educational situation was that that freshman year of high school, I had no support, nothing, nobody helping me, and then all of a sudden I went from that to classrooms where we had 5-6 people in a class. So what I ended up going to was my boarding school was literally, and they're much bigger now, they're huge now. But when they were just starting out, and we had 50 students total from middle school through high school, right? We had classes of like 5 kids at a time. And so you were getting all kinds of individual attention, and your teachers were able to watch over your shoulder and see like, why aren't you getting these things? Also, because I was at boarding school, we were having study hall every night from 7 to 9. So, which of course we rebelled against and, got in the principal's office quite a bit. And since it was a boarding school, like, definitely got into, but at the same time, this school was so cool about punk rock that they let me take over a tool shed and turn it into a practice space. And, we're banging out Dag Nasty covers, in the tool shed with my bandmates who were in college, down, which was super, weird. So, which I'm sure students going to Brem these days, if they know that, one of their, that in years past they had a guy doing a band in one of their tool sheds, probably think that was pretty funny. But anyways, so we had this tiny school, and but all the individual attention meant that for things like, I always give this example, we had a math teacher, we called him Dr. Paul. Paul Kasuth, I think was his name, and he was the first person to ever play Throbbing Gristle for me, by the way, because he was like an old hippie, and he the way he taught math, for example, was like the very first day of class, he made us throw out the textbook, and he said, "We're going to race a cardboard boat in a cardboard boat regatta." We're like, "What? What does that have to do with math?" And he was like, "Oh, wait, you'll find out." And then I remember telling him, I don't swim very well. And then he's like, "Well, you better do good math then." And it was great. And, we made a boat out of cardboard, and then he would say, things like, "Well, what are you interested in?" And I would say, minor threat, and then he'd be like, "Well, let's talk about how math affects music." And we'd do a whole lesson on, I remember him doing a class on the math of punk rock on the fly, because I said, the thing I was most interested in was minor threat or something. And I just threw that out there, right? But because he had 6 students, he could do that, right? Mm-hmm. And he could really give you that kind of individualized education. And, for that reason, and it's funny because music had taken over my life too. I wanted to, I was into hardcore in the same way. And it's funny because our life paths are so similar. You got the same things. And as kids. And so, what's funny about that too, Duncan, is that I think about it is that I was growing up in Bloomington, Indiana. You were growing up in Louisville, which is only 3-hour drive from each other. But most kids growing up in Louisville and Bloomington are never going to meet each other, right?
Right.
But because of the tribe that hardcore was, we ended up becoming friends and seeing each other at shows, several times a year, because we were both going to Dayton for all the Dayton shows. We were both going to Columbus for all those shows. Mm-hmm. And that's when we both learned that we were going through these things. So we talked about these things that far back. But for me, I still, I wrote that first attempt at a novel in my notebook, and it was terrible. I realized that. And then I got to the point where when I started learning how many rules there were to grammar, for many years I was like, you know what? I'll never learn all those rules. And so I gave up on writing like in the early part of my life until I started doing zines, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my earliest zines are terrible because they're all caps. Because I was afraid, right? Like the very first issue of VoiceBox is all caps because I was afraid and I got made fun of for it, right? And I fixed it by issue 3 and found somebody to help me edit.
Mm-hmm.
But the very first time I tried to do a zine, I was so afraid of grammar, I just made everything all caps because I was honestly terrified of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I didn't write for years, is that I was afraid of it. And so the process of learning to write was one of like, all right, well, fuck, now I got to learn that as an adult because I was scared of it as a kid. Now, I did what I had to do to graduate school, to learn the rules enough to graduate from school, but to take it where I could like sit at the computer and write a story, I had to retrain myself as an adult. Did you have anything like that, like specifically holding you back or scaring you in those early days when you started to take reading and writing seriously? Because I know that's pretty hardcore for me.
Yeah, I mean, there was, because I started so late, I think, and I had aversion to reading just from, I hate to say trauma response, but I guess you could say it was a trauma response. I would write and I'd do zines and I'd communicate and then I'd misspell things because we didn't have spell check back then.
Right.
And there was this weird sense of shame when you would make a mistake and people would call you out on it and they would not say, oh, you misspelled this. They would make fun of you, right? That's just how people are. And I think if I had I think, when I teach classes at the university, my students feel they have a good grasp on grammar, on punctuation, on all of these things. But I find that they don't as much as they think they do. But if I were to try to introduce grammar or punctuation lessons, I lose them sort of their attention span. And so it's a delicate balance with them. And for me as well, I think sometimes, there's certain words or rules I have to look up every time because my mind won't remember them. But I try to make it very clear. I try to work with them. And I think with me as a writer, and I'm not sure if I'm entirely going to address your point here, but I was very heartened in a way by reading the Kafka's diaries because his obsession with exactitude and precision in writing, it taught me to edit and revise my own work in a very mindful way repeatedly. That every opportunity to have your eyes on this thing, using a variety of techniques of changing fonts, of printing out, of doing it on the screen, of sitting on it for a few months. Those things help me as a writer see with new eyes.
Well, and you've also experimented with breaking the rules a little bit,
Oh yeah.
Especially, I think in SuperCell Anemia, right? Like there's all kinds of funky grammar in that one, or am I remembering that right? I read that book when you put it out, so I'm
in the unique position of
you're re-editing it right now, right? So.
Right. Very slowly because I don't have a lot of time right now, but it's a lot of green writing for sure. And
I love
some
that
of it,
book. I love it. So
thank you. I'm always surprised by how many prepositional phrases are in there. I'm just like, wow. All right. But there are a lot of errors in there. And I think that if my editor, who I believe you worked with at one time, if they had been a little more, I think that they were a bit of a hands-off editor. And so I think there's a lot of errors in there that could have been caught. I'm grateful for that they took a book and that they believed in it, for as briefly as that press was around. But, when I look at it now, going back, I'm like, woof, oh boy. Woof.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm sure you do that with, I mean, all artists do that, I'm sure you do that with Endpoint Records and, and Guilt and everything. But, I hate to dance back around to something, but just because it occurred to me, but another one of those things where I just hear you telling your story and I'm just like, God, that's exactly my scenario is that I had the exact same thing with reading where, like, even though I was reading Stephen King and Dune and Clive Barker and whatever, my father, and partially because my reading bounced up a lot in the year after my mother passed. And my father, who was suddenly a single dad with a 16-year-old and me being 12 years old, and being the academic that he was, is he basically said to me at one point, and I don't think he's basically said to me, I will buy you any book you want, as long as you prove to me that you read it. And, so, here, I'm having to have discussions with my father about the body politic, the story about like hands and a revolution and whatever. And a lot of it went over my dad's head, but he, would listen. And I will say, this is my copy of my very first Clive Barker book, the same one that I had, The Inhuman Condition. My copy of The Stand, which still has a note to must do social studies report, from 7th grade in there. And I still have those beat up copies. And what's hilarious to me about, when I hear people now, because I'm more friends with parents, right? And they're saying like, I just can't get my kids to read. And how many times I've had to suggest to them, well, have you ever sat down and read with them and said, here, I'm going to set a timer every night after dinner and we're going to read for 30 minutes and I will read with you, right? Mm-hmm. My father and I did that. Like after, the year after my mother died, he would, before we would clear the dishes from dinner, he would basically look at the time and then he'd pull out a book, I'd pull out a book. Now, at the same time, my father was a guy who used to watch sports with a book in his lap, right? Because he was an academic. And so now when I watch football, I always have a book that I'm reading because there's a lot of dead space in football. But I learned that from my father, and I think it's so important for people that if you have a kid with a learning disability and you're listening to this, wondering like, how do I get them to read? How do I take care of that? Like, you have to lead by example. And the fact that your father said like, I don't have much, but I'm going to make sure that you have these books. And I think that's key to that is like to encourage that reading. If you get a chance, if you find something that they like, even if I don't give a crap about Harry Potter, but if there's a kid who's going to read Harry Potter, great, go do it, right? Encourage reading. And I do think, being a part of it with them, that's a huge part of it. And for me, in breaking down and learning these systems, when I decide, I've always wanted to be a storyteller because of the power that I felt reading this book, right? Mm-hmm. Now, is Clive Barker my favorite author as an adult? No, he's not. I have a lot of authors that I prefer. I mean, I'm spending 5 years of my life devoted to studying Philip K. Dick now.
Right.
And he's not even my favorite science fiction writer. I have my reasons for doing this. But he is one of my favorites, but I'm spending 5 years doing this Philip K. Dick thing. Now, I've learned a lot, and it's been an interesting thing, but that power of what I felt in seventh grade when the two stories that broke me, that turned me into wanting to be a writer, was The Raft by Stephen King. I talk about it all the time on this podcast. Stephen Graham Jones and I spent almost 25 minutes talking about The Raft. So you should go back and listen to that interview. He's a way smarter guy than me talking about it. But The Raft and The Body Politic, partially because The Body Politic was so goddamn weird. And I was like, and it made me feel so many things. I wanted to do that, right? I wanted to do that. Just like I wanted to do punk rock because I wanted to make the feeling that I had when I saw Endpoint or when I saw Sick of It All, right? And I was like singing along, and I wanted to do that. I wasn't as good at that, so I didn't succeed in that. But with writing, I found a system and I found a way to succeed at it because, first of all, I could do it by myself and I could train myself. But to say that, I got 8 books on the shelf right now and I've probably written twice as many, right? But the thing is that I don't think I would have ever been able to accomplish that if I didn't have a school that specialized in trying to reach somebody like me. And I was lucky, right? And so I would say, even if you didn't finish school at DePaul, don't you feel like a huge part of that is having somebody, at least for a short period of time, like that woman that says your intelligence terrifies me, even just having somebody say that had to trigger something in you, right? Like those years had to be very important. I'm sorry, I talked a lot. Duncan, go.
No, it's okay. With that, I did actually finish there, but they were considering another year so that I could. I think it was as punishment for acting out. Really, it was just
right.
But my parents were smart to that, wise to that little play. I think it's always good to feel a sense of when you're validated in some way. But I think it's much harder to find that in yourself. And I think that's why writers struggle, the average writer struggles with reading his or her or their work one day and saying, this is the worst thing that has ever been written by a human being. And then coming back another day and saying like, oh, it's really not that bad. And as people who grew up at odds with certain kinds of thinking, right, processing, writing, it's a whole different kind of struggle, right? And there are some times where I get so involved in editing and thinking about a word, right? Just a word, that I go in so deep with it that the word no longer has its wordness and it becomes this weird abstract. And I'll have to pull back and say like, well, is this a word anymore? And kind of like, but I like that. I like kind of going in microscopically and looking at the language and, asking those important questions. And like you've published 8 books. I am so slow in getting my books out sometimes because I'm so slow to let them go.
Right.
And, and I've gotten a little bit better about,
Well, Dog Between was one that came together pretty quickly, right? For you. Yeah.
Yeah, that one was kind of, close to its form now, within a year of it first coming, probably less than a year.
Yeah.
But that was the first time. I mean, it's the most realist novel I have, right? Everything else is odd and speculative in some way, but this one is very much.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited that you've hinted that you're working on a horror novel, which I'm very excited.
Yeah. I hit a moment today where I said, "What is?" I was working on it, and I was like, "Would it be more scary if someone didn't, if somebody sees something?" And I'm like, "Would it be scarier if no one else sees it, or if then later someone validates that they had seen it?" And I'm like sitting there in this cafe going.
Those are the things you think about. Yeah. Well, it should be noted that a lot of my novels spend 15 years in my brain before, like Ring of Fire, for example, was one that I thought about for 15 years, researched and everything, and may seem, the one that I'm publishing next year with Clash is the quickest from idea to finish that I've ever had. This one hit me like a lightning bolt. Can't talk about it yet. However, a lot of them spend years gestating, and I don't have the problem that you do with the letting go. Once I lock it in, and I know that I feel good about it, I can do that. However, I do, don't think either way is right, because I think that whatever your process was for like The City Awake, for example, like I love the finished product. So if you tortured yourself over it for a couple years, sorry you did that, but it worked out for me as a reader. So I'm okay with that, so the process can be different for everybody. I don't find, it's funny because I see posts sometimes that writers do on Twitter or Facebook where they talk about writing like torture.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't relate to that at all because I fucking love it and I wish I had more time to write. And like, so whenever people are like, writing, to put memes about like writing is torture, I'm like, well, fuck you, give me your writing time then.
Right. Right. Well, I think they do that. Those are like harvesting moves.
Yeah.
Right? There's a friend of mine that the majority of what they post is to farm likes, right? My Twitter's very unprofessional. I don't have any methodology. I'm just like, this is something I listened to today. But I think, I don't find anything torturous about it. I think there are moments that I would like to have finished a project sooner in its whatever draft version, but playing with language is a great privilege, right?
Yeah.
And just, wow, what a great thing to do. and I think that, I also, there's, as you know, in the writing world, there's a lot of privilege where maybe this is the toughest thing that some of them have come across in their life is,
That's an interesting point. Yeah. Well, and then you get these little, I don't know. Anyways, for me, as far as like when I first started, and I said this is like when I first started doing zines, it was like I couldn't even grasp like the idea of like having to know which letters were capitalized and which words were capitalized and which weren't, just like scared the shit out of me. But I had this drive and passion to do the zines and to do the thing, right? And for me, and it's not that I don't care about activism anymore, but for me, the way that kind of music took over for a few years of your life, where, that was like the thing for me, it was activism, and it was like getting arrested a bazillion times and like, doing those things. And it's not that I don't care about those issues anymore, because I do. I just, found that strategery was a little bit better as I got older, and found ways that I wanted to communicate my issues. And And a lot of it was like saying like, hey, I've always cared about storytelling, so now I want to use my storytelling for good. And it's not that I write didactic horror because not everything's political. That being said, all these things, I had to train myself. I had to tell myself like, well, okay, well, if you're going to do this, you can't not care about these things. You're going to have to train yourself. And honestly, doing track changes with your editor who's like obliterating your manuscript will teach you grammar super fast, and like I know some people don't like that process of going through and doing those things, but
Mhm.
I do. Your people are lucky as hell that Grammarly exists now. That's a thing that I would have like probably traded a toe for at a certain
Mhm.
time in my life. Now, all these things, though, like you have to, if you're going to sit down and write a book, like everybody has to do it a little differently. People, there's the whole great debate between pantsers and people who write from outlines. I'm an outliner. And for me, that was one way that, and I, I had heard a quote where Richard Matheson, the author of I Am Legend and a bazillion things,
Mhm.
he had said that he thinks of the moments of suspense in a story as rungs on a ladder, that you're climbing to the ladder. And honestly, even though it was just he was talking about suspense, for me, thinking of a story as rungs of a ladder that I'm climbing was super important. And I know some writers hate outlines. Me, I need it. I need it. I need to be able to look at the map. I can ignore the map sometimes, but I need to look at it. I need
Mhm.
to look over, and also because like I don't have the privilege of being able to write every day. So I need to have my outline and my map. Now, when you started writing these serious, longer pieces and getting more into it, what are ways that you were for me, the outlines was about managing my disability, a lot of it.
Mhm.
So, what are ways that you manage your disability in order to become a novelist, and to do that, to be a
Yeah,
writer?
in that way, you and I are probably pretty far apart, right? I
Right.
love, you call it pantser, which I think is an interesting term, but I've
Seed of a
actually never
Panther.
heard.
You've never
What's
heard
that?
you've never heard Panther? This
Seed
is
of pantser? No, I've always, in my whole world of writing, we call it uh, discovery.
mm,
And and so for me, most of my writing story ideas come to me as a sound or an image, like it might be a first line that just kind of comes in my head while I'm driving and I stop and write it down somewhere. Um, and and as I go, I allow my subconscious to have a little bit of freedom in guiding me. I think, some spiritual people would call them muses, but I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just that my mind is always working in the back on some things. And so I get a thing moving where I'm sort of getting it. And then if I hit what people might call writer's block, I jump and just put a character in a situation, right? Or I, write some mood scenes. And as I go, so with the book I'm currently working on now, I think I got about 150 pages in. Then I looked at it structurally a little bit, and I said, this is the first time I've actually ever done this. And then I created little slugs for those sections that I wanted to add throughout. Usually I get the whole thing finished. I print out the sections or chapters and I lie them on the floor and I read each one and I grade them, evaluate them, and decide which ones are getting yanked and rewritten, or which ones, are pretty good and just need uh, uh, a little bit of love. But I think, so to answer your question, I have a lot of different ways, but the one that I tell my students can be helpful is to write a book in moments. That books exist not as a grand narrative necessarily, but as real moments that exist on a timeline. And then I say, give yourself different draft versions, right? So you may go, like one, I'll go through and look for missed opportunities where I can expand interiority or something like that. I might then go look for narrative spandrels or themes, like either sonically or words like that connect to certain metaphors. I'll do multiple passes where I pay attention to language. And as an editor, most of the manuscripts that come my way as a publisher are so clean that I don't worry so much about the punctuation and grammar, but I do sometimes get in there and show them ways that a line could be a little more energetic and musical.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that fine line between giving somebody too many comments to process and enough comments that it helps them guide themselves, right?
Right.
And I don't know with Lisa, because I believe that's who edits your books now. I'm not sure what Lisa's approach is to editing.
I've worked mostly with Christoph at Clash, but yeah, he's really hands-on as far as, well, with Killing Machines, like, he made me start the novel at chapter 5 and rewrite the whole thing. Like, he just, like, told me, like, hey, chapter 5 is where it all starts. And, he had a huge impact on it, because that next draft, really made the book work in a lot of ways, because I was spending too much time world building to that point. And he knew that that's where the story started. And what I appreciate too is with an editor is when they'll tell you, a lot of editors, like, they, first of all, they'd be afraid of the amount of work that's involved to tell you something like that.
Mm-hmm.
They would just turn down a book and say, well, it didn't start at the right place, so I'm not going to do it. But what I really appreciated was Christoph was like, told me, like, hey, I really like this book, but you started at the wrong spot. and here you go. And, and then there's and it works differently. This book that we're doing next year, like, he basically told me, like, don't change a thing, when it came in. And, we feel like it's, and I knew that I've never been so confident in a book, Duncan. I wish I could talk more about it publicly. I've never been so confident in a book. There's ones that I've written that I like better, but I'm not as confident in, right? I'm really confident in this one. And so, but it's funny because, an editor can, really, like, you have to be open to listen to it too, because other people have other eyes, right? But I will say, and another thing about the difference between your assistant, the discovery thing, like, I do want to defend outlining a little bit as far as discovery goes, because I am a person who, I'm religious about outlines, but for example, in my science fiction novel, Not Alone, I had two characters that were romantic interests, and within one sentence looked at it and said they're brother and sister. And that's way more interesting, this relationship of their brothers and sister. And in the middle of a sentence, decided that and rewound to the beginning of the novel and started over. And then just, the outline's fluid. I had outlined the whole thing with them being romantic partners, and then realized that their relationship was much more interesting as brother and sister. Right? Changed everything. The outline changed a lot.
Yeah.
But so discovery is the thing that can still happen in those.
Oh, no. And that wasn't my,
Yeah, I know you weren't doing that.
But. Yeah. We all come to our stories and how we do them in different ways. And I don't think any one manner is better than the other. So I always say to writers, know yourself. Know yourself and know what's going to work for you. One thing that I thought was really interesting that Matt Bell does is, and by the way, his new book, How to Refuse to Be Done, I'm going to do his little plug here, it's a book on craft that's actually, most books I get on crafters, I'm just like, eh. This one is really smart. And so one of his things he does is after he finishes a draft, he rewrites it.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of like, I think part of it is retyping it, but it's an interesting thing because it gets you to think about the book in a different way. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And then I sort of said, okay, all right. Well, if I hate it so much, maybe there's something to it. Yeah. And I've talked to some other writers who do it, and they and I have rewritten it, but I'm so I do so many drafts. Like I'll be working and 30 pages in, I'll start revising. And, whenever I'm not feeling particularly creative, I have those moments of where my maybe more logical mind's on that I want to look at those drafts.
Well, Punk Rock Ghost Story, my novel Punk Rock Ghost Story, because we spent 7 years from when I first thought of it trying to convince people that the band in the book was real. I had 7 years between when I sold the idea to Jeff at Deadite and when it came out. And at the beginning of the 7 years, I wrote a draft of it. And when we got close to the time, because we made a literal 7-year plan of how to, they included the documentary that we made and all that other stuff to do the Blair Witch thing of like convincing people that the Fuckers were a real Indiana band from 1982, right? Uh-huh. And so because we had that 7 years, by the time we got around to where Jeff was like, oh, it's almost time to publish Punk Rock Ghost Story, I was like, I need to start it over. And because I was such a better writer that I literally did not look at the other draft, not once, and I just started from page 0, and it was the same story, essentially the same outline, but I just started from scratch and rewrote the whole thing. And so that's the only time I've really done that. Mm-hmm. And oh my God, it was such a better book. It was such a better book because all the, first of all, for thinking about the story for 7 years still, right? And then just the idea of like, you've grown as a person since you started it. And also because but I'm glad that version existed. I'm glad I wrote that other version because I got a lot out of my system. And for one thing, it was, I tried to be too tricky with it. I tried to do some in first person and some, because there was time jumps and all this other stuff. And then I simplified it. I just made it better. And now I'm very, very proud of that book. But, and what it says about punk rock too. But, which, a few people have caught on to. But, I was really trying to use the ghost story to talk about punk rock before the internet and punk rock after the internet, right? Mm-hmm. And how different punk rock pre and post internet is, and actually having those 7 years to meditate more on and see the differences, like what was important. It was good. It was a good thing. That's interesting. Matt Bell, I need to read that book because I just saw an interview with him and I really appreciated his point of view in it. I actually enjoy craft books to a degree, but I also reserve the right to internalize and move on. Right?
Well, I think the one reason I really disliked him is because there's a lot of filler. I feel like if it was just a bullet pointed list of things, I would get more out of that. But there's like, there's a whole narrative you have to do to make it a book that I'm just so disinterested in usually.
Yeah.
But I think it's very interesting that your process. I very much liked hearing about it. For me, it's very different because I think, and I just realized I don't know what you do for a living, but like my job it's so it takes your life in this way, right? It occupies. It's a big part of your life, and so I have to do so much work with writing and editing and all of that. That there are just some days that I just like I don't want to write. Like I'm just tired, and I just want to just stare into space, and sometimes just I can lose half a day just going. But I think
I'm in the same field as Rob, by the way. I work with kids with autism, so
okay,
yeah,
and so as well, right? Like reaching out to people. So I have to create times, right? Like for writing and I learned this from Brian Evanson, who if you're
been on the podcast before, so
if you're ever with Brian, I stayed with him in Rhode Island once when he was there, and we'd be having a nice conversation, and he'd just look down and go, "I'll be back in 15 minutes. I'm going to write," and he'll just go up there and he'll write because he has a writing habit that he does. And for me, I do it. The writing I do in public spaces with ambient noises because it gets me out of my house, right? So on my days that I don't teach, I go to a cafe or a restaurant and I sit down and I write. And when the pandemic hit, I could only do that in the summer, which was, it just stopped progress on a book. Revising is a whole different thing. I need quiet and I focus, but so like my process is very unique in how maybe it's not unique to other academics, right? But like to a lot of my writer friends where they're like, "Oh, I sat down for 7 hours and wrote today," and I'm just like, I don't ever have 7 free hours, right?
Well, see, as for me as an educator, it's one of the reasons why I stay doing being a teacher's aide with kids with disabilities is because the vacations are important for me, the breaks, because we get breaks throughout the year, and so like Christmas break is like that's go time for the novel because I do like 14-hour days. Now when I'm working, I wake up at 5:30 and I write till I have a 5-minute commute to work on my bike, and so I write in the mornings from 5:30 to 8:10.
Wow, that's idyllic.
Yeah.
No, my commute is 1 hour each way on the highway. It's not fun, especially in South Dakota in the winter. But
well, I pay out the nose for living in Ocean Beach, but
no, it's my dream. Like when people are like, "What are you going to do if you win the lottery ever?" I'm going to move to California and work at a pizza place. it's
right.
Always like, just like that just sounds like heaven. But yeah, like in the summers, like last summer, I lost the summer to a spinal issue that had me in a lot of pain and the doctors a lot. But usually that's when I really do a lot of work for the press, right? Like that's when I have time and I'll maybe revise the website or I'll put in an accounting system or I'll, edit several of the books that have been picked up or I'll design some of the covers, like that's when I can have time to just dedicate to that where I'm not just doing, because I really, what I do professionally has other components like South Dakota Review and Astrophil Press. So and committee duty and all of that. And it's just, your brain is just tired at the end of the day.
Totally.
And so I think, kind of speaking about dyslexia, one thing I find very good about it is that we are creative thinkers, right? And this is something that you find, or we excel in other areas that cause us.
There's a lot of writers I could have called on today that I know who are dyslexic,
Yeah, like Carrie Edwards is deceased, but Carrie, unlike you, who did all caps, they did lowercase.
Yeah.
Everything in lowercase. And she used punctuation creatively. And
so did Cormac McCarthy. So
right. And I think Caitlyn Jenner was a runner, right? It's rare that I will reference Caitlyn Jenner in any sort of positive light, right? Like, but that story.
Whoopi Goldberg's a famous person with dyslexia too, who's a very creative person. And I reference her partially because she's been really outspoken about it. And I know, like, I used to know more of who, because at my school they used to have like framed photos of all these famous people up.
Right.
So they were like, hey, remember, you can be like these people,
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is, we are creative people, because I think, also, we've had challenges and we've had to work around them. And those of us who, because that's the thing, is like, not to pat myself too hard on the back for something, but, and I'll say this about you too, is that we're both, I know I'm a smart person, right? And I had this period in my childhood where people were calling me dumb, but I knew that I was a smart person. I knew that my parents were both smart people, and that I came from smart people, right? And that I had this, ability to learn these things, but I knew that I had challenges. So, and for example, and one of the things, like, as far as your place in the hardcore scene is always funny to me, because I said at one point, like, I remember saying to somebody they were talking about By the Grace of God, and I said, you shouldn't be surprised that there's two academics kind of hit the forefront of that band, because you can listen to the band and know that they're smarter people, right? It doesn't mean, and for example, too, like, another person who has all kinds of learning challenges and has made it in our scene is Carl from Earth Crisis. And one of the things about Carl is that people don't know is Carl is insanely knowledgeable about history. And if you get Carl going, right, talking about history, which I have, right, many times, Carl's insanely knowledgeable. But if you really parse down Earth Crisis lyrics, you see that. But also, Carl is a person who writes great lyrics for his band, and how does he do it? He does it in a very different way from most people. He did it in a way that is similar to what we're talking about learning our, because he and I have talked about, like, learning, like, getting around learning disabilities and writing. And Carl, every Earth Crisis song has been a story that Carl has written, an entire story, right? And what he does is he writes entire stories, pages long, in his notebooks, and he underlines certain passages that make it into the lyrics. And that's why some of the songs, like Cease to Exist or Cities Fall, are more cinematic than a lot of other hardcore bands, because he was straight up writing a story about society collapsing and turned it into Cities Fall. He was writing a story about nuclear war, it turns into Cease to Exist, right? Wither is about people fighting heroin addiction. And this is the Earth Crisis nerd in me coming out. But this is also the guy who sat down and asked Carl, like, how do you do it? how do you write such incredible lyrics coming from a position of like, and I don't think he's diagnosed with a learning disability, but he and I have talked about it, and we know that he has one, right?
Mm.
And whether he was diagnosed with it or not, but when I lived in Syracuse, I spent many hours talking to Carl about dyslexia and my challenges. And I learned a lot, and that's when I started asking him about his process, because I was like, I wanted to know. And it's really interesting to see. So like if you go back and you listen to like some of those songs that are more cinematic, you can tell this. His writing process is such an example of learning to cope with your disability, right? Because he doesn't write songs like, I don't know how most people write lyrics, right? But I learned from Carl, so I learned his system. So now, like, when I wrote the lyrics for the Fucker songs for Punk Rock Ghost Story, I did what he told me to do, which was listen to the music a bunch of times, catch the rhythm, write it out as a story, underline the parts that you think are going to make it, and then put them to the music, right? But he figured that out because, like, he was a person that had all those same challenges as us. Like, he had people, I think a lot of people from hardcore are people that got bullied as kids and found, power and strength in it. But anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. Now, all right, so Duncan, you've given me a lot of your time, and we've talked a lot about the learning disabilities. Before we get into where people can find your books and your work, do you have anything else that you want to kind of conclude with about like the journey and the process of being a writer with dyslexia? Because my whole goal today was to give people inspiration that like they can do this. Like being a person with dyslexia, you can, because the thing is, whether you are a bestseller or win awards or whatever, the greatest reward you're ever going to have as a novelist is seeing the completed work in your Word doc, whatever, like it's done. That's better than all the other shit, in my opinion. Like that feeling of completion.
Yeah, I always tell people enjoy the 15 seconds after you see your book, because the crushing reality of life comes right back after on its tail.
Right.
You're like, oh my God, what a great moment, my book. And then you're like, shelf it. But I think, I think that what's key to when you're someone like us is it's part of that punk rock ethic of just don't ask for permission. Just do it. Just go for it. And you know what? People might not get it, but you're not doing it for them, right? You're doing it for, yourself. And I've heard a lot of no's in my life. You've heard a lot of no's. I've been told I'm stupid or I'm not talented or, whatever decision it is, I've been told no. And I just have always been, maybe it's dumb enough to go, I don't care, right? Yeah. And Jason Harmacher is this way too, is that, his whole Syria project was like, academics were like, well, no, there's no way you're talking to these religious leaders and getting to record them. And he's like, no, I did. I just asked them and they said yes, and he just did it, and he did it himself. And I just think that that's really important because people with learning challenges are going to, or neurodiversity, people who are neurodiverse as well, like we're going to be told that no, and this isn't how it's done. But we can reinvent things and we can make a space, and eventually people will accept it, right? Mm-hmm. They'll see, right? And if you have an editor who's smart enough to see your worth, right, and not say, this needs editorial work, but sees your vision, that's a really great thing, because I think you're right. A lot of people look at it and say, I'll have to work on this, and it might not make me a lot of money.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, the nose are a big thing. You have to be able. You can't do this if you don't have thick skin. First off, like
Mm-hmm. Oh
Frank.
no.
Yeah, Frank Herbert got Dune was rejected by every publisher to the point that the original hardcover of Dune was published by an auto parts catalog publisher who and who took a chance because he was like, wait, I think this is great. And then he's like, I guess I'm in the science fiction business now.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was rejected by everybody now. We wouldn't have Dune if, like,
Mm-hmm.
Frank Herbert had been like, everybody's rejecting this. I don't see it,
Yeah.
And it requires, it's a thing, but, and look, and I just want to say on a personal level, like, um, like for anyone who doesn't know what the hardcore scene is like, for punk rock in the early '90s when you and I were growing up, we would travel around and go to everybody's shows in other cities, and so we had friends in all these other cities, but it's not the same as like having friends that you're around every day, but the people that you saw in these other cities, they mattered to you. They cared because you related to them because they were
Mm-hmm.
the weirdos in the other town like you. And one of the reasons why like Endpoint and your other band Guilt were always important to me is because I was looking up on stage and seeing somebody playing music who I could relate to because you and I would talk about. I have a very distinct memory of standing out in front of a show in Dayton and us having a conversation about dyslexia because it was a life changing moment for me outside the news space. I believe Step Down and Endpoint were both playing that night, and I
Could
remember,
be.
I remember it was 1991, and I was going to boarding school already at that point, and you just telling me like, "Oh, I have dyslexia too." And yeah, I had challenges. Yeah, people used to call me stupid too. Like I very distinctly remember having that conversation with you, and because later on that night you were rocking out with Endpoint, you know, uh, I went home with In a Time of Hate and was the most recent record at that point. Catharsis was recorded. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
out, but when I got home to my boarding school and I'm telling the other two punk rockers at the school, "Hey, Duncan, the guitar player from this band he's just like us." It was powerful. It was meaningful, and so that's something that still 30 plus years later I hold on to, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you. So thank you, Duncan, for that. On that
Mm-hmm.
note, I I see your books on my shelf right below me. They're under a stack of James Reich's books, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So in a very valued place. They all three of the books of yours that I have, SuperCell Anemia, Dog Between Us, and City Awake, are fantastic. I know I still have a few books of yours to get. Of Flesh and Fur I don't have. But tell the folks about your books and where they can find them. And I know you got plans. Supercell's coming back out, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not 100% just yet. Uh, we'll see once the draft is finished, the revision. But I have two novels, yeah, on Stalking Horse Press. You can order through them directly or online somewhere or through your local store. There is a collaboration I did with uh, um, oh my gosh, Daniel, and it's called man, yeah, my brain is not participating. Uh, the House and the Haunts. I'd remember it on a good day. I think I'm sundowning, but Of Flesh and Fur is actually now out of print. They only printed 500 of them, I think. And so they only keep, the cupboard only keeps like a few people in repress, and it's usually their solicited authors, like Evanson or Bell.
I'll still track it down at some point.
I'm sure somebody's selling it. It won't be like on eBay or whatever, on Amazon. Whenever you look up my first book, it's like, you know, their algorithms are so crazy. They'll say like $7,000 some days. It's like,
yeah. Well, you know, it's funny how too sometimes like a work like that can just bounce around, and then somebody can and find it. But the City Awake and A Dog Between are easy to find. They're and they're both highly recommended from me. I think City Awake just touched me a lot, and I remember you and I had a discussion about that book too when I was testing the waters with my interview abilities. But so there is somewhere on YouTube a discussion of Duncan, or where Duncan and I are talking about that book, which was funny because I totally misread part of it or had an interpretation that you found very interesting. So if you want to go back and hear that discussion, it's funny because I like way read deeper into it in some ways too. It was kind of funny, but I love that book. I thought it was excellent. And A Dog Between was it's a very emotionally heavy book in a really cool way. And just as your friend, I just I kind of felt every page of it in a really cool way. I really appreciate that book as well. So, and I appreciate your time and for talking to us about this. The other thing about this is just to remind people with learning disabilities, you have the power to overcome these things. They're not going to rule over you because you can. I just realized that I have this book called The World Hitler Never Made, about alternate history, and I have this swastika that's been hanging over my shoulder the whole time.
Luckily,
it's a history book about alternate history because I'm a Man in the High Castle nerd, and I just realized I had a swastika over my shoulder this whole time. That was really kind of dumb. All right, on that fun note.
It's just you're gonna blur it out, right?
Yeah, I'm not as good at the video editing as the audio editing is the thing. I got to get better at that. But yeah. Anyways, it was awesome talking to you, Duncan, about this.
Yeah, it's always great talking with you.
Yeah, and I'll have you back for something a little bit more fun at some point. But it's cool too because I had Rob on. So now I've had. Two Louisville hardcore icons on already. So like Rob was cool because we talked about we did punk rock history for the first part and then talked about working with people with disabilities for the second half. And
cool.
Yeah, and that was really exciting for me because to see, it is really exciting to see you guys that I know from the bands like doing such great academic stuff and like giving back, because like you guys always were such a positive force in our hardcore scene when you weren't stealing parking meters.
Were you there for that? Yeah.
Yeah, I put on that show.
Rob was not involved in that. So.
Yeah, well, somebody was. And
I don't know who was. But,
on that note, have a great day, and thanks for being on the show.